Hi, I'm Daniel Drezner from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I blog at foreignpolicy.com.
And I'm Matthew Yglesias, and I'm a fellow at the Center for American Progress.
And we are here today to talk about diplomacy, and I guess we start on a sad note.
Yes.
As one of America's great diplomats, at least of the post-Cold War era, Richard Holbrooke passed away 2 days ago. Matt, I think you already blogged about this, correct?
Yes, I did.
And what was, unfortunately, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I mean, it was topical, and he's, not someone I knew, unlike a lot of people. But what I thought was interesting in it was sort of that he was really until he died of people, practicing diplomacy, sort of the only, really well-known, really high-status diplomat that we had in the United States, in a way that really sort of contrasts, I think, with figures on the military side, where in particular, anyone who kind of rotates in to a substantively important military position kind of automatically becomes a high status, person in American politics and media and things like that. And, I ended my piece with this sort of odd fact that David Petraeus he did a sort of a Holbrooke obituary appreciation piece, and he quoted himself as referring to Holbrooke as his, quote, civilian sidekick, which I think in a lot of ways was civilian wingman, which I think was sort of a accurate, description of how the relationship between civilian and military work in Afghanistan goes. But it's not really, I think, the way it's supposed to be.
Well, I would say a few things. I mean, First, I met Richard Holbrooke a couple of times. I think I made him extremely happy once, my first year as a professor, because I actually assigned his book, To End the War, the chronicling of what happened in Bosnia.
Which is a good book.
And he was just delighted to hear that. I think one of the great things that senior policymakers love hearing is that their books are actually used in university courses. It's fascinating.
Yes.
I have mixed feelings about this because Holbrooke was certainly a larger-than-life personality. Let's put it that way.
Right.
And in some ways, he benefited from that fact because he could really steamroll over a lot of people that perhaps more diplomatic diplomats would have been somewhat reticent to do. On your point about sort of the relationship between the military and the civilian side, I think you're absolutely right with respect to Afghanistan. There was a great piece by Daniel Dombey in the FT talking about the fact that really, as much as Holbrooke was ostensibly, supposed to recreate what he did in the Balkans when he was appointed the envoy there, in point of fact, I think your colleague Brian Katulis was quoted in this. In point of fact, it was Petraeus that was really the point man. I think, to be fair, part of the reason for that is that it's simply different if there are U.S. ground troops involved than if they're not. In some ways, Holbrooke was able to do what he did in Bosnia because there weren't any U.S. Forces on the ground. And it was eventually air power. And I think what Holbrooke was gifted at, in a way that perhaps fewer other diplomats were, was using the prospect or the actual fact of military coercion as a way to get what he wanted at the diplomatic table.
Right.
And in some ways, you kind of wonder if he had, let's say, been in Iraq when the surge started, because we talked about this before. As you point out, the surge had a military component and a civilian component. The military component was supposed to, obviously stabilize the country, but the civilian component was to actually create a functioning Iraqi government. And you wonder that if someone like Holbrooke had been there, pounding his fist on the table and saying, "You guys have to form a government now," would the civilian side have worked better? And that's entirely possible. It's actually ironic that. Holbrooke passed this week. I don't know if you know this. The State Department just released its first QDDR, Quadrennial Diplomatic and Development Review, which is basically states' attempt to.
And this is actually the first one. I mean, it's not really quadrennial.
Right. Well, I mean, it's
aspirationally it is.
Right, aspirationally, exactly. But it is the first one. I mean, it's clearly designed to mimic the Defense Department's QDR.
Right.
Process. And in some ways, it's good that they're they're trying to engage in this kind of planning process.
Right.
But on the other hand, reading the document, at least reading the executive summary, it's mildly depressing. Not because the content is bad. The content looks, about 50% boilerplate and 50% interesting ideas. It's a question of whether or not the funding is going to be there.
Right.
And I think in some ways, the problem you're talking about, I think, has less to do with the personalities. Because someone like Tommy Franks, for example, I don't think of as terribly important civilian. I mean, I would amend your point about, military figures becoming prominent political figures. They have to be perceived as being successes in the military front.
Sure.
So that's important. But that said, you're right. I don't disagree with that. The real problem
there's a question. People sometimes, you talk about the funding issues, and it's natural that a military undertaking is going to be more expensive than a civilian diplomatic one.
Oh, right, yeah.
But there are questions about sort of the trappings of power. There was this quote that Holbrooke had given to Der Spiegel some time ago, where he said, Petraeus has more airplanes than I have telephones.
Yeah.
And that's not just, the military has military planes that, drop bombs on people. It's actually, the case that high-level, flag officers can fly around the world in what amount to private planes for their own transportation. And assistant secretaries of state don't have that. And, it's on the one hand, it's a convenience, but on the other hand, it's an important status symbol. People who can fire up the jet and cruise around the world have a kind of, stature and prestige, that those of us who are, booking commercial flights just don't have.
No, it's true. I mean, in some ways, this goes all the way back to, I don't know if you remember this. I think you were an undergrad at the time. The Washington Post about 10 years ago did a sort of a special on the Sinks, the commander-in-chiefs, the regional commander-in-chiefs. I think it was called Washington's Praetorian Guard, or so. I think that was the title of it.
Yeah, and this became, was it Dana Priest's book?
I want to say that sounds about right. I won't swear as to who wrote it, but I mean, it was sort of the kickoff for this kind of argument that, in fact, the Sinks, the regional theater commanders in the military, had greater diplomatic clout than the ambassadors or the assistant secretaries.
Right.
I don't disagree with this, and this has been an ongoing problem, and in some ways, this was a problem even before 9/11, and that was during a time when the defense budget was not necessarily growing. It was just that the State Department's budget was being cut even further, and it's been exacerbated by the fact that, you've got so many, aggressive military theater operations right now. I guess the question I have, though, is I take your point about the fact that, a military commander can just get on a jet and go somewhere. I'm not sure what you think the civilian equivalent of that could be, though. I mean, even if, let's say we lived in a dream world, and I'll get to the fact of why we don't live in a dream world in a little bit, but let's say we lived in a fantasy world where you, in fact, could give the State Department similar level resources in terms of logistical capabilities. What could they do? I mean, would it literally be that they would be showering bags of money on, various people? I'm not sure that there's anything quite as impressive as a military jet landing, I guess.
Right. But, there's a lot of things we could do to show that we, take sort of more seriously the State Department functions. One would be not handing ambassadorships out as kind of, political patronage appointments.
Right.
I mean, if you were... I think the president, in some legal, theoretical sense, could make his campaign donors, 3-star generals. But, of course, nobody would do that.
No, this isn't North Korea. That's too bad.
Right. That would be insane. And so the fact that, the military is run by professional soldiers is a token of us taking the pursuit, seriously.
But in that sense, you're right. I mean, the State Department in theory is also run by the Foreign Service, which is, that is in some ways just a disciplinary organization. And I think you're right to observe that Holbrooke is in some ways interesting because he came through that Foreign Service.
Right.
In a way that, if you look at Hillary Clinton or Jim Steinberg or other sort of what would be considered foreign policy heavyweights right now, they didn't do that.
Right. Exactly. And, there's some certain things are not, a policy shift per se, but everyone who I'm aware of, who's prominent in American politics, goes out of their way to demonstrate that they respect the idea of the military, that they respect soldiering as a profession, and that and it's something we valorize socially, even though, his generals and admirals, they don't actually earn that much money compared to a corporate CEO or something like that, but they have a very high status in American society, which is in part, a grassroots, a bottom-up thing, but it's in part a top-down thing. I mean, we make a deliberate effort to valorize that kind of thing, which we don't really do with the Foreign Service and with, civilian side government activities in general. And I mean, of course, it's fine that, conservative people want to denigrate certain aspects of the civilian government because they, in good faith, don't believe in some of the functions of government. But I think actually that the conduct of diplomacy is something that, we do believe in pretty broadly across the political spectrum in the United States. And yet there's very little emphasis put on, really kind of elevating it and trying to make it something that people take seriously.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for this. The first is, as part of it is just Congress. Which is to say, if you want to fund the Defense Department, that means you are often engaging in massive expenditures in congressional districts.
Yeah, located all around the country.
Right, and the Defense
State Department's in D.C.
Right, the Defense Department, the Pentagon was very savvy in the way in which it does this. Right. Whereas on the other hand, when you're talking about the State Department, it's just a smaller budget, and furthermore, the Congress, in terms of their own self-interest, does not necessarily see what they gain from greater staffing of the State Department beyond things like advancing the national interest. And furthermore, we're about to enter a budgetary environment where, people are looking for things to cut. And guarantee, exactly. the first thing anyone ever talks about cutting, whenever we're in this kind of, austere, environment where austerity is thought to be a good thing, is foreign aid. Foreign aid is a great thing to cut because it's always seen as, not benefiting us, but benefiting others. And I think part of the problem is that neither the executive branch nor anyone in Congress gets a political benefit from making the argument you're making, which is to say, you know what, it's important to augment the civilian side of things because by augmenting the civilian side of things, we hopefully don't have to use the military side of things down the road. That's a good thing. And so, I mean, I don't think this is I genuinely, I know that Republicans tend to bash the State Department probably a little more than Democrats. I think this is genuinely it's not a partisan thing. This is just a sort of political incentive thing.
I tend to agree. Yeah. I think it's, well, and obviously the structural challenge, is sort of quite severe. But I mean, I do think you've heard some, at least nominal recognition from inside the military of, how this is sort of problematic. And, to think about Holbrooke's life and, really the achievement at Dayton, right? I mean, part of how that worked really was that, by having a civilian person front and center, the military was being used in the Balkans, really as a tool of policy.
Right.
Right, and there wasn't this sense that, well, the objective was victory, and then that everything we were doing was sort of being shaped around a sort of a nebulous, victory concept. That, objectives were being defined in a kind of, I mean, in a diplomat's kind of way of thinking about these kind of things, and then the military was being used as the military was a tool
rather than an end in of itself.
Right, and I think that while, I mean, of course, if you ask General Petraeus or other sort of high-level military people in Afghanistan, of course, they say there's political objectives to the mission and so on and so forth, but the institutional culture of a military, is quite different, and for very good reasons. And I think that it becomes difficult for sort of military officers to use themselves as a tool in that kind of delicate way, that they have a culture and a mentality that's about winning. It's about the sort of can-do spirit, that's
it's also about warfighting. I mean, in some ways, the primary mission of the U.S. military is to fight and win wars.
Exactly.
And the problem that they've got, and as you said, I think the military, both the civilian and the military side of the uniform side of the Pentagon, recognize this as a problem, which is they've been tasked to do a lot of things that traditionally used to be the State Department's role.
Yes.
Things like state building and so on and so forth. And I think you're right to some extent. Oddly enough, the rethinking of things like COIN and counterinsurgency strategies has actually been an instance where it's been a military-led strategy of what do you do in war-torn states. And as a result, they're the ones in charge, but they recognize the importance of civilian power, except I think the way it's happened, and again, this is for political and budgetary reasons, the military has had to supply both the military side and the civilian side.
Exactly.
I don't disagree with you on that. And furthermore, you had a situation where, in fact, on the State Department side of things, there was really a turning away from their contribution to this. I mean, if you remember, back in 2006, 2007, there were nearly open revolts in the State Department when Condi Rice was trying to expand the number of State Department employees in Iraq and in Afghanistan.
Right.
Because their attitude was they hadn't signed up for this. So, to be fair, part of this is, I think, and I think actually in some ways this goes back to Colin Powell when he was Secretary of State, because he wound up, as much as the narrative was about the fighting between Don Rumsfeld and Colin Powell over who was going to control post-war Iraq, if you read what actually happened, it was pretty clear that Powell decided the State Department simply lacked the capability to do this, and therefore was going to abdicate responsibility.
Right.
But I think
it's a...
Oh, go ahead.
I mean, it's sort of a spiral, where there's recognition in the military that there's a need for this kind of functionality. There's recognition in the State Department that they lack the capacity for some of this functionality. And there's recognition, I think, by everyone that Congress is more likely to be responsive to military requests than the State
and so
Department
you have a vicious feedback loop, which is... I mean, so I think we're in agreement on this, which is that, defense has acquired more civilian capabilities, state seems less capable. This, reinforces their reputations and also reinforces the congressional dynamic, which means defense winds up doing both the civilian and the military side. And I think you're right. I think it's not necessarily the best way in which you run a foreign policy. You do want a foreign policy where, in fact, it is the chief diplomats that are running it, and military power is seen as a tool rather than as the be-all, end-all. Now, that said, part of the problem here is, let's face it, our focus has been almost entirely on Iraq and Afghanistan. And once you've got boots on the ground, there is a compelling logic to why the military is going to have a greater role. I think the question is whether going forward you can have an instance where dealing with both sort of, failing states issues like, let's say, Pakistan, or, emerging crises like North Korea, can you have the civilian side of the leadership really being the serious part of the leadership?
Yeah. And, I think in some ways you even see a parallel develop. I mean, in countries where we have a much less militarized relationship, like with China, that there's enormous involvement by the Treasury Department and other sort of economic agencies, which, again, is happening for very good reasons. I mean, we're, I assume, not going to invade China. So, the military role is relatively modest. We have a very important economic relationship with China. The Treasury Department has a lot of economists working at it, has certain kinds of expertise, has certain kinds of access to the president. We also have much more of a tradition of making the Treasury Secretary be a kind of an expert who is appointed to do the job rather than a well-known political figure.
Yeah, that's true.
So, right. I mean, so although
the Treasury Secretary traditionally has always been, at least historically, in the post-Cold War, has been someone who's been associated with Wall Street, which is both good and bad depending upon your point of view.
Right. Well, I mean, there are some problems with it, but I mean, it's exactly the point, right? I mean, we have not. It's been a long time since the Treasury Secretary has been a sort of a politician or quasi-politician.
Yeah, I mean, Lloyd Benson is
a lot of our recent.
I think Lloyd Benson is the last one I can think of. And actually, the Bush exceptions prove the rule, which is you had Paul O'Neill and John Snow, and I think those two were widely considered as pretty much disasters as Treasury Secretaries. So, yeah, that reinforces your point.
Yeah, and, I mean, there's good and bad reasons for that. But in an interesting way, I think that the formal sort of diplomatic element, tends to get squeezed out in in a whole variety of ways, which does make me wonder sometimes if we're thinking about the right kinds of issues all the way around. I mean, for example, even in the AFPAC type situation, Holbrooke initially wanted to have his ambit expanded to include India,
right,
which wasn't done, for some good reasons. And
yeah, I was going to say, I think there was actually a compelling logic for that, but go ahead.
No, I mean, there actually, I think there was a very compelling logic, yeah. But there was also, you can see why it was that he wanted that.
Oh, yeah.
For reasons beyond personal greed. And so, the question is if the primary point person for a relationship with Pakistan is the head of CENTCOM, right, is that person the right person to think about, to keep in a long-run perspective, America's relationship with India and its importance relative to our relationship with Pakistan? Because it seems to me that 100 years from now, we're going to look back and say that the U.S.-India relationship during a period of relative American decline was more significant than, who controlled the town of, what's-its in Kandahar province.
Well, okay, I would say a few things on this. First, it's worth bearing in mind, and again, this is where you have to bring up Holbrooke's faults a little bit.
Yes.
Part of the reason the Indians didn't want to deal with Holbrooke was they didn't want to be lumped within AFPAC. They wanted to be thought of as a separate power. So I think we were in agreement that was probably a wise. There were justifiable reasons for not giving that part to Holbrooke, and the second reason was that Holbrooke, as much as he was could really steamroll through a lot of people. The downside was he could steamroll through a lot of people, and he often left a lot of bruised egos along the way, and led to a lot of this way. It was a style that worked perfectly when dealing with someone like Slobodan Milosevic. It was not clear at all that it worked well with someone like Hamid Karzai. That said,
plus it seems ill-suited to me to actually send him to try to boss around a giant country that, wants to think of itself as a major power.
Right, in that sense.
Right, I mean, that actual idea didn't work.
Right, and I think that was, so in that sense, I think the constraint of his role was probably a wise one. I'll defend David Petraeus a little bit, though. I mean, partly, I take your point, and I share your concern to some extent about whether or not the military, whether there's too much of a militarization of foreign policy, not in the sense of we're just thinking bombs first, but rather the Defense Department is running too much. That said, in fairness, it should be pointed out that Petraeus is hardly someone who would be thought of as just a sort of narrow-minded soldier, where his only experience was in the military. I mean, he got a PhD from the Woodrow Wilson School.
Sure.
He's someone who has thought, somewhat about international relations, and in some ways, this reflects the fact that today's U.S. military, as you point out, it's been valorized, but also it's particularly in the higher level officer corps. These are people who have often been educated not just in the military institutes, but have gotten PhDs from places like Princeton or Stanford or the Fletcher School, for that matter.
Right.
And as a result, do have greater. They're not just soldiers, and so in that sense. I'm concerned bureaucratically because I would like state to have a greater role, but oddly enough, I think some of the generals and admirals that you're seeing running things do have greater diplomatic experience than we would have thought of, let's say, a generation ago, perhaps.
Right.
So in that sense, I do think David Petraeus is quite aware of India as a great power and that there are other, aspects at play. In fact, I mean, if memory serves, one of the more interesting interactions, I think, during the 2008 campaign took place when Obama went to Iraq and met with Petraeus. And I think, Obama was willing to push back on Petraeus in terms of what their grand strategic visions were. And I have to think that in some ways it led to a slightly increase in mutual respect, that Obama had greater respect for Petraeus because he did see the big picture, but presumably Petraeus also had greater respect for Obama, recognizing that he saw the big picture as well.
Right. Right. No, I mean, but, I'm not sort of here to malign, any particular general. It's just that, institutions matter and bureaucratic setups and culture. And I think you definitely see a very good faith effort by high-level officer corps and the whole military training program to transcend some of the difficulties of the current situation.
Yeah.
They're not unaware of the problem. They're not even failing to address it. I just don't know, that it really works. I mean, this was the I think we referenced the book in the Washington Post, but of the sort of that whole proconsul, concept. I mean, it's not that I think we should stereotype the military leaders as like fools or cavemen or people who don't understand what's going on.
Right.
But it's difficult task, and there's a reason why that's not sort of how we intended to set this up.
No, I agree. And no, I didn't think you were thinking that. And I think the problem, as you said, is that because of the current circumstances, the military is adopting short-term solutions to this,
right,
which try to make their job a little easier because they that's what they're trying to do. But the
exactly.
short-term, as a result, sabotages what should be long-term reforms of the sort of balance of power, for lack of a better way of putting it, between civilian agencies and the Pentagon. And in some ways, it's interesting that we haven't talked about the QDDR all that much because the point of that, at least in theory, was to sort of augment what Hillary Clinton, I think, labeled civilian power.
Right.
And, again, reading this is just reading the executive summary because I couldn't read the 250 pages this morning. And this is, I should add, the brainchild of Anne-Marie Slaughter, actually, who's the director of policy planning at State. And again, the document is better than I think expectations would have led it to be. Mm-hmm. But again, reading it, the only question I had after looking at it was implementation, whether any of what is being said is going to be done will actually be done. One of the other things you were talking about economics. One of the things it proposes is the State Department literally create a chief economist. Which is not a bad idea because often even though the State Department has a large bureaucracy devoted to economics, they've never been a real heavy hitter on that front.
Right.
Treasury's always had the lead, and it's not necessarily that they shouldn't have the lead, but again, it's a question of, in some ways, it's a question of policy integration more than anything else. Mm-hmm. And again, the tragedy of this is that although Anne-Marie Slaughter was, I think, the person behind this. My hunch is she's going back to Princeton in 6 weeks or so, because her 2 years are up. So it'll be interesting to see whether going forward, this becomes just a document like any other document, or whether it actually leads to real policy change.
Right. Well, and obviously, just in budgetary and economic terms, this is like not the right time to unveil your proposal for institutional capacity building.
Right. And the tragedy of this, and I still remember this because when I was teaching back during the campaign. If you took a look at all the major foreign policy, all the major presidential candidates in 2008, both Republicans and Democrats, Foreign Affairs ran that series of foreign policy essays by all of them. Yeah. And what was striking was across the board, from Rudy Giuliani to John Edwards, you had all of them saying we need something like a civilian, Marshal Corps or, an augmented civilian capacity on state.
Exactly.
So it's very clear that once you run for president, you actually realize this is a real problem. The tragedy is that Congress doesn't care.
Right. Yes. Exactly.
And so, unfortunately, I don't think we can agree anymore on this. So,
it's terrible.
I know. Speaking of Congress, though, they are furiously at work trying to get all the lame duck stuff done.
Yes.
It looks like, I'm going to ask you on this because you being in D.C., I think you paid a little more attention to this, but it sounds like START is now going up for debate, or New START is going up for debate, and it looks like potentially that it's going to pass.
Yes. I mean, I would say it seems to me like it's going to pass, and that what's primarily happening is that Republicans, a certain number of pivotal Republicans, are trying to wield the potential of it not passing as kind of a way to squeeze as much time on the calendar as possible. So we're hearing complaints now that 3 days of time to debate it isn't enough time for such a significant treaty, which of course would be true. I mean, if we literally only had 3 days to debate this treaty, that would be silly, but we've had like a year. In the real world, debate doesn't begin and end when Harry Reid puts things on the Senate clock.
Right.
But the point is that, the more time you can chew up with START, the less time there is to, give people a hard time about DREAM Act, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, other things that have less support.
Well, I will say this about START. I actually find what's happened over the past month mildly optimistic about what's happened, which is, you originally had John, is it Kyle or Keel? I don't know how you...
I think Kyle.
I think Kyle, yeah. You had John Kyle, who was really the Republicans' point man on this. originally saying, you know what, I don't think talking about this during the lame duck session is a good idea. Let's wait for the new Congress. Right. And, that seemed like that was it. It seemed like it was over. And what was interesting was the Obama administration did not, relent on this. Right. They actually went to the mat on it. They got, the Pentagon to actually say, by the way, it would be really nice if this was passed. A whole bunch of Republican heavyweights, Eastern European members of NATO and so forth. And, it looks like it's actually going to pass now. They at least had the votes for moving it to a debate. And, it's unclear whether some of those Republican votes for cloture are going to go in favor of the treaty for a variety of reasons. But I have to think Republican senators don't want to be in a position where they say, I voted for START before I was against it.
Right.
I think in the mildly optimistic point is that it actually turns out that, this might be an issue where, in fact, the sort of dreaded partisanship of Washington does not actually prevent a treaty, which is, to be blunt, modest in terms of its effects.
Right.
But that said, modest and probably unambiguously good as far as most people are most foreign policy analysts would acknowledge.
Yeah. Well, to be pessimistic about it, though.
Okay.
The thing is that if you're doing an after-action report on this, right? You're Barack Obama, you're anyone, you're some future presidential candidate. You're looking at a really overwhelming quantity of support outside the Congress. Initially, in terms of former Republican secretaries of state, former Republican presidents, the military. When I was in Germany last week, and their people were like freaking out about the idea that this would die and kind of leave Europe, like oddly stranded. And it's for a treaty that's like not that big a deal in substantive terms, but that to not be able to get it ratified would have had, a sort of a meaningful impact on the psychology of the whole situation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Precisely because the treaty is so modest.
Yes.
People don't expect you to be able to, create world-changing disarmament agreements, but they expect, I think, routine updating of existing treaties to go through.
Right. So,
and it turned into a huge political headache for, say, because it hands off at some point, right? You have the State Department and you have the, Undersecretary for Arms Control, and you're discussing the treaty. And then at some level, it kind of gets handed off to the, the legislative affairs people, the political people in the White House. And the price that, was extracted for getting it done in terms of delay, in terms of hard work, it was really high. And I think it sends a message to senators who are not that interested in foreign policy, to legislative affairs people at the White House, God forbid the Secretary of State comes to me and wants to talk about some more treaties.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, all right, I'll push back a little bit on this. I take your point, which is that in some way, the mildly optimistic thing is that it looks like it's going to pass. The mildly depressing thing is that this was such an anodyne treaty that it should have passed. This is one of those treaties that 30 years ago would have passed 98-0 and wouldn't have been that much of a pain. I think in some ways, what John Kyle wanted was not entirely unreasonable, which is he wanted greater money for nuclear modernization. This was not an as I said, I don't think this was an unrealistic. I thought that was actually a justifiable thing. Bob Gates had endorsed.
But he got it quite quickly.
Right. And so...
if that had been if we had had all this delay and all this difficulty because of a standoff over John Kyle's request for nuclear modernization money, I would understand that. And it would be, I think... But, the Obama administration was always willing to make that concession.
I agree. No. So you missed it. I was about to agree with you, which is to say, once Kyle then got what he wanted, and then he still said, I don't think that the treaty should be up. I actually think, I agree with you. Kyle had, as near as I can figure out, no genuine reason, no valid reason to oppose the treaty. And he even admitted that, I think, in his justification. He said the treaty is fine. And he actually said, and this was, I think, the most disturbing part of this whole thing, was that he didn't trust the president, even after the money was agreed to actually spend it on what it was suggested. And that does suggest a sort of poisoning of the well on foreign policy matters that I do find profoundly disturbing. That we've had periods of fierce partisanship before. This isn't terribly surprising, but the notion that this was somehow that you wanted to deny Obama a victory on foreign policy for political reasons rather than realizing, hey, this could actually really fuck up U.S. relations with Russia, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, NATO, and, oh, by the way, Afghanistan and Iran.
Right.
Just minor lists of things that would potentially, impact U.S. national interest. That was disturbing. The way in which I'm mildly optimistic is that I actually do think Kyle overreached on this. And again, the fact that you've got, what looks like a treaty that's going to pass suggests that maybe that was hopefully the high watermark of partisanship. I'm always extremely optimistic on this front and usually have my hopes dashed down the road. But that said, the fact that the treaty does look like it's going to go forward, and of course by saying this, I'm sure I'm sabotaging its chances.
Probably.
But assuming, I'll say that, if the treaty is actually passed during the lame duck session, maybe this is one of those instances where, in fact, Republicans realize, and both parties realize, look, there's some things that perhaps we should not actually turn into partisan issues. Maybe. I mean, it'll be.
I normally try not to be the guy who's like being preachy and partisanship is bad or politics should stop at the water's edge. But I mean, where it definitely partisanship is bad is where there isn't genuine disagreement.
Right. But no,
right.
I
think that some kind of log rolling and stuff is always part of, Congress. But that it gets dangerous, because I think we've had a lot of hints of it recently this week, and may continue to, of efforts to log roll against really strongly unrelated issues. That, nuclear modernization money versus arms control treaty, I mean, there's like a close link.
No, as I said, that was a sensible thing to link those two issues. It was justifiable, I thought, for Kyle to bring that up in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
But things like, I want to delay ratification of a treaty I support for as long as possible, because that will make it easier for Jim DeMint to delay an omnibus appropriations bill, which may set us up for a continuing resolution fight in March rather than in October. It's hard to know exactly where to draw the line exactly, but the way the American system goes, if you can't reach deals with the opposition party members on a case-by-case basis, if everything becomes about the whole suite of political disagreements, you have a real problem. It's not possible for Barack Obama and John Kyle to forge a comprehensive coalition government.
No.
And you need to be able to keep things, to keep the range of disagreements relatively contained, or else the problem is just that issues that are of secondary political priority will never get on the table.
Right,
and that's just foreign policy's problem. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, it's like if the cost of doing non-controversial treaties is that important measures relating to gay rights and to immigration reform don't get votes, then Obama's political coalition is going to insist in the future on not moving foreign policy priorities forward.
Yeah. No, you're right in the sense that the most disturbing thing about the New START business has been the transaction costs involved in getting it ratified, which, as I said in the past, probably would not have been that serious of a problem. I mean, if you want to get to whether or not how serious this is for our system of government, I mean, I think this goes to an old bugaboo issue of yours, which is we now live in a world where you can argue that it's certainly the Republicans and increasingly the Democrats are operating like they have party discipline now in a way that mirrors European parties to some extent.
Right.
But the problem is we don't operate in a parliamentary system of government. We operate in a presidential system of government. And, for up until recently, traditionally, the way that large bills were passed was usually through appeasing or compromising with the liberal/conservative wing of the other party, and thereby developing some bipartisan support. Now you're in a situation where you're right; it requires a kind of grand bargain, and that is ridiculous. It can sometimes, on rare occasions, work, but most of the time it doesn't.
Yeah, well, I mean, exactly. And, of course, the problem, I mean, this is a sort of general structural problem, but it's like, nobody in the electorate sort of really cares one way or the other about something like New Start. But people do care, if it happens, if, like, important crises break out, around the world. There's already so many sort of structural factors weighing against, like, just sort of practical, crisis mitigation, like, let's just try to keep people happy, sort of preventive steps. And so, it's bad to see these kind of things.
Well, in some ways, this actually ties back to our previous conversation about civilian power, which is, you can argue that one of the problems that the United States is having to deal with right now, which it hasn't had in an internet age, for lack of a better putting it, is what happens domestically now has serious foreign policy implications in a way that I don't think it used to have even 10 years ago, or even 15 years ago, which is, you now have some jackass, threatening to burn a Quran in Florida. That has foreign policy implications. When you have, Congress seemingly, operating in an extremely dysfunctional manner, and even if it finally, ratifies New Start, this has been one of these things where the rest of the world is looking at Washington thinking, this is how you guys operate? It's not a good, it sends a lousy signal. And in some ways, this is something that I don't think, the U.S. government or the U.S. polity really has had to cope with yet, which is the notion that our domestic debates, and our, domestic policy, conundrums wind up actually having real-world consequences. And
I feel like that linkage did exist in the past, but that at least during the high Cold War period, it more ran the other way. That people would say, well, civil rights is important for our relationship with, newly independent states in the third world. Or people would say, okay, we need a trade policy in East Asia that helps build up the economy of our allies.
No, you're right in the sense of, in the Cold War, it was easier in the Cold War because you could always use the foreign policy justification to get certain things passed through Congress. That said, I don't think the Civil Rights Bill passed because the argument was, we need to outreach to...
No, I don't think it did. I just mean that the linkages existed, but were just more often ran in the other direction.
But in some ways, I'm talking about something
people
different.
Appealed with at least a little persuasiveness.
Right. But in some ways, I'm talking about something different. You're talking about major pieces of legislation like the Marshall Plan and or the Civil Rights Act. In some ways, our problem now is that that's actually not the issue. The issue is that you've got stupid debates out there, people who are not actually in charge of the U.S. government but say dumbass things that wind up having foreign policy implications. So you've got number of foreign critics berating, let's say, Sarah Palin for arguing on Facebook that, the U.S. should assassinate Julian Assange.
Yes.
Now, she doesn't have any power. She doesn't have any official power. And, in the past it used to be that if someone said something that's stupid, I'm not sure it would have had foreign policy implications.
Right.
And now it does. And I actually find this profoundly troubling for two reasons. The first is again, I'm not sure the U.S. does terribly well as a result of that. But second, and in all fairness, I really do have a problem with debate being affected inside the United States by the notion of we have to worry about how we look to the rest of the world. Again, I don't endorse anything Sarah Palin said on WikiLeaks or the burning of the Quran or what have you. But I actually do like having a free and vigorous debate on these subjects. And so when you have people like, let's say, David Petraeus saying, don't do this or don't talk about this because it hurts our interests in Afghanistan, that's an integration of foreign policy and, sort of the way in which domestic debates take place that I find profoundly disturbing.
Okay, yeah. I didn't totally see where you were going with that.
Sure,
but
okay.
I mean, okay, right. Part of it, definitely when I saw, military leaders saying, well, you shouldn't burn Korans because it puts troops' lives at risk.
Right.
I definitely thought, well, on the one hand, it's true. You really shouldn't burn Korans.
Right,
It's impolite. Yeah. I don't know. That's me. That's how I was raised. but it is, and like that's.
That should be a good enough. Like that, really.
That should be a good enough reason, really.
Yeah.
At the same time, you should not have generals, commanding generals scolding private citizens for the rudeness of their conduct.
Right.
That's a very kind of distressing sort of thing. But then you think. I feel like coming to that point was the intersection of so many different kinds of trends. The greater transparency of American society to the world, thanks to information technology, our greater involvement with certain kinds of state-building capacities, sort of a cross-cultural, interaction with the masses, so to speak, in the Muslim world, and with the I don't want to say politicization of the military, but just the growing role of military figures in political debates as we've sort of been in this wars that go on for a long, long time. And you sort of come to the conclusion that this is, I don't know, it counts as a reason to worry about the costs of such large-scale, consistent military engagements around the world. Not to say that we shouldn't do things that are genuinely vital. We shouldn't do things abroad that are genuinely vital to our national security. But this is, the kind of reason why I think the early republic was suspicious of, large military establishments and permanent foreign entanglements, is that you wind up with this weird feedback loop into domestic politics where suddenly, it's, everything that the military said about that was correct. And yet it was still disturbing.
It was disturbing to come
where
from
this
the
is
military.
what was happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As said, you don't want, it's true. I'm in the same position, which is I agree burning Qurans is rude. But I don't think it's the job of military officers. I'm not even sure, frankly, it's the job of people in the executive branch, period, to say, don't do this, because it hurts our interests. As I said, I want the widest possible, exchange of views in this country. It's presumably one of the things that makes us makes a relatively robust civil society. The problem now is whether or not the cost of doing that, in terms of how the rest of the world perceives us, it's growing. Let me put it that way. And I think, as you said, this is an issue that we have yet to wrestle with. To be fair, it's an issue that I'm not sure any country has yet wrestled with. We could point to China and how they've had to deal with things like, let's say, the Nobel Peace Prize, and they did not handle that terribly well either. So, in some ways, this is. It affects the U.S. most because we're still the most powerful country in the world. But it's something that increasingly, I'm not sure how to deal with, and it's I might have to write something about this, but it's going to be in some way. Oddly enough, the point of the QDDR was to deal with 21st century statecraft, and in some ways, I think this is the most profound, vexing question for 21st century statecraft, which is, what if the one key component of your statecraft is what you do domestically, and that is not seen as a purview of foreign policy, but yet in actual fact it is. And what you do on what you do on a civil society level domestically counts too. In a tricky way. Yeah, and the problem is these are really profound and interesting foreign policy questions, but because no one will think of them as foreign policy questions, or no one has traditionally thought of them as foreign policy questions, there is going to be a lot of resistance to inserting that foreign policy dimension. And I share some of that discomfort, as I think you do as well, as we said on this. And you're also dealing right now with an American public that really is more isolationist than at any point, at least in the last 30 years, based on public opinion surveys. And so, there's going to be some serious... There's going to be some serious and profound, blowback if this is attempted to go, if you see
Yeah. Right. People don't want to hear about it.
Right. And on that front, I'm afraid I think we need to wrap up.
We should head out. So, well, let's just say North Korea. That's thorny.
Yeah. Well,
they're bad dudes.
I blogged about this a week or two ago, where I said, frankly, the thing that worried me about North Korea was not the artillery barrage and that belligerent behavior. It was the fact that suddenly they apparently had built a light water reactor de novo, And we're seeing more evidence that apparently their nuclear program is much further along than Iran's, and much more sophisticated. My concern about this is that the Clinton/Obama policy that had been implemented since 2009 was basically one called strategic patience, which was the notion of once the North Koreans have finished acting like a spoiled child, then we can finally, actually have negotiations. Was based on the premise that the status quo actually favored the United States as opposed to North Korea, because even though North Korea had nuclear weapons, they didn't have anything else. What is seeming increasingly clear is that North Korea is going to have a lot of nuclear capabilities if the status quo persists in such a way that I don't think anyone had anticipated 2 years ago. And, the other thing that's changed, I think, is the South Korean population's perception of North Korea, which for, a decade or more had been relatively dovish, for lack of a better way of putting it.
And they've turned.
And they've turned to the point where, I find myself in actual rare agreement with John Bolton, where I'm beginning to think, you're going to need the only way in which you can change the status quo at this point on the North Korean side of things is to make life uncomfortable for China, to have more military exercise in the area, because the only other policy response is to buy off the North Koreans, and I think it's safe to say that in the long term that doesn't work terribly well.
Well, all right. We should wrap this up.
Okay.
I agree with some of that, but call me old-fashioned. I actually just find it disturbing that the North Korean military is shelling South Korea.
Yeah, no, that's
Sinking
obviously.
Boats. It's rare that you meet the kind of really hard to understand decision making. But the North Koreans seem to have really credibly persuaded me that they are erratic.
Yeah. Well, I don't know
in their actions and not to be
trusted. I'm not sure. All right, I will give a rational defense of what North Korea has done, which is I think what North Korea has been doing is trying to. There's two things. The first is presumably this is part about bolstering the credentials of Kim Jong Un, Kim Jong Il's son, who went from being a 24-year-old playboy to being a 4-star general in the North Korean army.
Yes.
Really, I wish I had that kind of meteoric success. And presumably this is about bolstering his bona fides in what is going to be an extremely shaky transition. The second thing is that I assume North Korea has basically figured out or betting on the notion that the South Koreans never want to escalate because escalation is costly for them in a way that it's not necessarily costly for North Korea. But I will say again, I'll end on an optimistic note. Based on North Korea's propaganda, the sort of their news reports since the shelling, it does seem like they've recognized they might have actually misstepped here, which is to say there's a contrast to what happened with the Cheonan sinking. With the Cheonan sinking, the North Koreans were actually pretty silent about it. They didn't issue anything until even 3 weeks after the sinking. They've been nonstop trying to argue this time that it's not their fault. I don't believe that it's not their fault, but what I think is interesting is that the North Koreans do believe that they need to explain that it's not their fault.
They're feeling some kind of heat.
Yes, exactly. Now, whether or not this actually leads to anything down the road, I don't know. But it might be that North Korea, again, like John Kyle, has recognized that they've actually reached that red line that they can't cross. Whether or not they continue to cross it, on the other hand, is disturbing. I think one of the profound ironies about the North Korea situation is that as much as we've been talking about, 21st century statecraft and how non-state actors are important and the internet and so on and so forth, that in some ways the crisis of 2011 might be a good old-fashioned traditional interstate conflict.
Yes. Well, and North Korea has managed to create a society that's, basically immune to modern information technology.
Yeah.
Those kind of...
Although even there, it's weakening a little bit because they...
Well, sure, right. But I mean,
But no,
to speak loosely, it comes closer to a traditional,
Yeah.
You've got the state, and you're engaging with the state apparatus as such.
Okay. All right. I think we probably need to wrap up now.
Let's go.
But
all right,
Matt, have a good winter break and have a good 2011.
Yes, you too. Great.
Bye. Do what he did in Bosnia because there weren't any U.S. Forces on the ground. And it was eventually air power. And I think what Holbrooke was gifted at, in a way that perhaps fewer other diplomats were, was using that the prospect or the actual fact of military coercion as a way to get what he wanted at the diplomatic table.
Right.
And in some ways, you kind of wonder if he had, let's say, been in Iraq when the surge started. Because, we talked about this before. as you point out, the surge had a military component and a civilian component. The military component was supposed to, obviously stabilize the country, but the civilian component was to actually create a functioning Iraqi government. And you wonder that if someone like Holbrooke had been there, pounding his fist on the table and saying, you guys have to form a government now, would the civilian side have worked better? And that's entirely possible. It's actually ironic that Holbrooke passed this week. I don't know if you know this. The State Department just released its first QDDR, Quadrennial Diplomatic and Development Review, which is basically states' attempt to. Hi, I'm Daniel Drezner from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I blog at foreignpolicy.com.
And I'm Matthew Yglesias, and I'm a fellow at the Center for American Progress.
And we are here today to talk about diplomacy, and I guess we start on a sad note. As one of America's great diplomats, at least of the post-Cold War era, Richard Holbrooke passed away 2 days ago. Matt, I think you already blogged about this, correct?
Yes, I did.
And what was, unfortunately, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I mean, it was topical, and he's, not someone I knew, unlike a lot of people. But what I thought was interesting in it was sort of that he was really until he died of people practicing diplomacy, sort of the only really well-known, really high-status diplomat that we had in the United States, in a way that really sort of
to end the war, the chronicling of what happened in Bosnia,
which is a good book,
and he was just delighted to hear that. I think one of the great things that senior policymakers love hearing is that their books are actually used in university courses. It's fascinating.
Yes.
I have mixed feelings about this because Holbrooke was certainly a larger-than-life personality. Let's put it that way.
Right.
And in some ways, he benefited from that fact because he could really steamroll over a lot of people that perhaps more diplomatic diplomats would have been somewhat reticent to do. On your point about sort of the relationship between the military and the civilian side, I think you're absolutely right with respect to Afghanistan. There was a great piece by Daniel Dombey in the FT talking about the fact that really, as much as Holbrooke was ostensibly, supposed to recreate what he did in the Balkans when he was appointed the envoy there, in point of fact, I think your colleague Brian Katulis was quoted in this. In point of fact, it was Petraeus that was really the point man. I think, to be fair, part of the reason for that is that it's simply different if there are U.S. ground troops involved than if they're not. In some ways, Holbrooke was able to do.
I think with figures on the military side, where in particular, anyone who kind of rotates in to a substantively important military position kind of automatically becomes a high status, person in American politics and media and things like that. And I ended my piece with this sort of odd fact that David Petraeus he did a sort of a Holbrooke obituary appreciation piece, and he quoted himself as referring to Holbrooke as his, quote, civilian sidekick, which I think in a lot of ways was civilian wingman, which I think was sort of a accurate, description of how the relationship between civilian and military work in Afghanistan goes, but it's not really, I think, the way it's supposed to be.
Well, I would say a few things. I mean, First, I met Richard Holbrooke a couple of times. I think I made him extremely happy once, my first year as a professor, because I actually assigned his book.
It's actually the first one. I mean, it's not really quadrennial.
Right. Well, I mean, it's
aspirationally it is.
Right, aspirationally, exactly. But it is the first one. I mean, it's clearly designed to mimic the Defense Department's QDR.
Right.
Process, and in some ways, it's good that they're getting they're trying to engage in this kind of planning process.
Right.
But on the other hand, reading the document, at least reading the executive summary, it's mildly depressing. Not because the content is bad. The content looks about 50% boilerplate and 50% interesting ideas. It's a question of whether or not the funding is going to be there.
Right.
And I think in some ways the problem you're talking about, I think, has less to do with the personalities, because someone like Tommy Franks, for example, I don't think of as terribly important civilian. I mean, I would amend your point about, military figures becoming prominent political figures. They have to be perceived as being successes in the military front.
Sure.
So that's important. But that said, you're right. I don't disagree with that. The real problem
there's a question. People sometimes, you talk about the funding issues, and it's natural that